Battletech, a Western mecha franchise that has spanned board games, novels, TV shows, and even video games. Created in 1984 by FASA Corp and changing hands multiple times since then, the series has seen hundreds of entries over the last 40 years. Battletech's stories take place predominantly in the 31st century and often involve warfare on an interplanetary scale. As such, there's plenty of opportunity to pretty much make any sort of story you want within the universe, and of course, the medium of video games has been home to many of these tales. Would it surprise you to find out that this storied franchise has a spin-off series exclusive to the original Xbox? Well, probably not because it's the title of this video, but let me introduce you to MechAssault for the original Xbox. Gamer crust on the case and everything. Not my crust either. I bought this one at a used record store for $5. And yes, I wiped it down with Lysol, but it really only penetrated the outer layer of whatever is on here. Hey, look at that! Xbox Game of the Year for 2002 from GameSpot and a website called Cinescape, who's since deleted the review. Yes, I checked. Whoa, uh-oh, looks like we're in trouble. This must have been part of a bundle or special edition or something. Either way, that adhesive is 20 years old and not coming off. Massive destruction. Captain, blow those World of Blake fanatics off this planet. You and your team are going in hard, fast, and first. That scum will soon fear Wolf's Dragoons and your stable of deadly battle mechs. The tactics are up to you, but don't hesitate to crush them in the rubble of their own buildings. Well, that's a little extreme, but hey, it all sounds good to me. Let's take a look inside the case and see what we're working with. Oh, well, the manual has no cover, and I can only assume it was eaten by a demon child between 2002 and now. The disc isn't in perfect condition, but I've seen worse, so it shouldn't be an issue. Anyway, let's stop stalling and pop this thing in. Oh, by the way, I haven't had an original Xbox since like 2009 when mine kicked the bucket, and even if I were to buy one now, there's a large chance that the clock capacitor will have corroded and burned out the motherboard. This is an unfortunate reality for the original Xbox console, so if you still have a working one, I recommend learning how to remove that capacitor to save the rest of the system. But the Xbox 360 is backwards compatible, so it should boot right up and... wait, it doesn't work. You bastard, the game was produced by you. What more could you want from me? It would seem that while this game's sequel is fully backwards compatible, this one, unfortunately, is not, leaving me with a wasted $5, or a mecha-themed coaster. But wait, what is that? Is that the sound of ocean waves? A rough and tumble galleon smashes through the waves and approaches. My savior hoists a flag above the deck, exposing the Jolly Roger for all to see. Yeah, I've had enough of this metaphor. I'm gonna emulate it, because you can't keep a good mech warrior down. Also, for what it's worth, the sequel is backwards compatible, so maybe if I can ever find that, we'll talk about it. Honestly, while I bought MechAssault on a complete whim, after taking a look at the review scores, I'm expecting it to be pretty good. I mean, IGN gave it a 9.2, and IGN is never wrong, right gamers? I do notice how many of the reviews are mentioning how great the multiplayer is, which is unfortunate because I just have no way to play it now. MechAssault is actually kind of an important game for the milestone of console multiplayer and matchmaking. This was one of the first Xbox Live games when it was released, so if you wanted to experience playing online from a console, it was either this or Unreal Championship 2. For what it's worth, it does seem like people really loved this game back in the day, and with a good amount of pilotable mechs and some fun modes, I can see why. I mean, this game had a Horde mode all the way back in 2002, which is actually kinda crazy. MechAssault was developed by Day One Studios, a group that started out making Axis and Allies games. They moved on to the MechAssault games and then even worked on the Fear series, specifically porting the first game to consoles and fully developing Fear 3, which is better left alone. They also made a weird 360 game called Fracture where you could raise and lower the terrain with a gun, and that's all I remember about Fracture. Guess what Day One does now though? That's right, they work in the mines creating content for World of Tanks after being renamed Wargaming Chicago, so at least they're getting paid. When it comes to the story of battletech in general, let me just say that I have no idea about any of it. I've read a bit from the wiki, and the general story about the clans and the inner sphere sounds pretty interesting. I just haven't ever really had the time to get into it. I bring this up because the battletech franchise has a pretty dedicated fan base, and the MechAssault games in particular are considered to be non-canon for a multitude of reasons. One of the big ones for the first game is the misnaming of some of the mechs. Yeah, I guess that they just used palette swaps for some of them, so a couple of the mechs here are misrepresented. There's also a bunch of other stuff that conflicts with the universe's canon, but I'm not going into it because it doesn't really matter for the purpose of this video. Just know that beyond MechAssault, there's a huge and varied world to dig into, and this original Xbox game isn't the best look into its scope and complexity. Our unnamed protagonist is a mech warrior holding the rank of captain for a mercenary company named Wolf's Dragoons. According to the Battletech wiki, the Dragoons are a very famous mercenary crew and are seen as general good guys that follow a code of honor and professionalism. We find ourselves orbiting the planet Helios, about to drop down to the planet to investigate a total communications blackout. Our dropship is shot down while attempting to land, and while the crew evacuates, we end up left on the crashed ship. With only one functioning recon mech left in the hangar, and enemy forces closing in, it's up to us to investigate a base to the north, taking out a few enemies in power armor once we get there. Back on the dropship Icarus, Major Kerensky and Tech Lieutenant Foster receive a transmission from the survivors of Bravo Lance. A Lance is basically a squad of battle mechs, and the Alpha and Bravo Lances evacuated the dropship before it was shot down. The Bravo Lance is attacked and destroyed by enemy forces, showing the insignia of a cult called the Word of Blake. These cultists are a sect of religious extremists that, depending upon the time period of the Battletech universe, are either a legitimate political construct within the inner sphere, or a bunch of crazy jihadists. The Blakeists we see in MechAssault are the jihadist kind, which would explain why they're so eager to get stomped on by a 75-ton war machine. Kerensky has us attack an enemy base housing their communications infrastructure, and this is the first encounter we have with an enemy battle mech. Mech-on-mech combat in this game certainly feels like two huge titans relentlessly battering each other, that's for sure. When compared to the enemy tanks that go down in a few shots, or even the power armor that isn't really a threat at all, an enemy mech is a totally different story. While MechAssault isn't an incredible game by any means, there was a moment after I fought my first enemy mech where things just sort of clicked, and I realized how much fun this game must have been when it was online at its peak. Mech duels in this game are a crazy dance of thruster jumps, gunfire, and rocket dodges. At least when you're playing as a light or medium machine. If you play as an Atlas, you just walk at stuff and fire your lasers. It's fun in its own sort of way. The story continues on with the player defeating the Word of Blake and recovering a variety of mechs to stomp around in. While the game does change things up from having you destroy everything on the map with missions that involve escorting allies or infiltrating a base and a stolen mech, honestly the single player campaign here is fairly forgettable. It's pretty obvious that the main draw to MechAssault was its online multiplayer, and honestly I had more fun hopping into matches of the Horde mode and just blowing things up than I did trying to grind through the story. Mission variety does get more varied as the game goes on, and eventually the missions become multi-part operations. In one, you chase down an enemy convoy carrying a Mad Cat heavy mech, disabling the convoy and destroying the escort. Foster then hijacks the Mad Cat and walks it back to the dropship. But he isn't an experienced pilot, so it's up to you to make sure that he makes it back safe. Finally, you hop into the Mad Cat and defend the dropship from multiple waves of incoming mechs. And the newly acquired heavy mech packs such a punch compared to the skirmishers that you've been piloting that it feels like you are the boss fight now. At the end of the day, the story is serviceable enough, and it eventually involves an ultimate battle mech, and I think a giant drill that drills to the center of the planet. But with it not being canon to the overall battletech world, and the campaign only lasting a few hours, especially once you unlock some of the more sturdy mechs, I just don't find myself clamoring to go back and play through it again. It's not bad, but it's also nothing special, and I hope the sequel tells a more engaging story. When asked about the core gameplay and systems of MechAssault, I think my answer has become a resounding, it's pretty fun. For a pick up and play arcade action game, it's fine, if not a little lacking in variety when it comes to weaponry. But if you're the kind of person who's invested into the mech action genre, or even battletech as a whole, I'm not totally sure that MechAssault is what you're looking for. For one, there's no mech customization at all, so if you're coming from a series like Armored Core on the PlayStation 1, you'd probably be let down by the predetermined loadouts. Personally, I think I would have been looking for something a little bit more next-gen back then, especially with Xbox being the new kid on the block. Each mech comes decked out with a permanent loadout, no switching out parts or customization here. You'll get ballistic, missile, and energy weapons on each battle mech, well, with a few exceptions anyway, and everything has unlimited ammo, so there's no need to worry about resupplying mid-mission. The weapons in MechAssault are actually pretty interesting, though there are a couple that are fairly similar to each other. For instance, in the energy weapons category, you have the pulse laser, the standard energy rifle that is fairly accurate and has a higher rate of fire. But then you have the medium laser, which is literally just the pulse laser, but mediumer? It just feels like a wasted opportunity. Luckily, the energy weapons category is saved by the particle projection cannons, which fire a ball of highly damaging electricity after a moderate charge time. Ballistic weapons fare a little better when it comes to variety. There's the standard chain gun, which is good for infantry and smaller vehicles. The autocannons fire explosive tank shells, and it almost looks like a mech-sized shotgun, so that just has cool factor right there. And my actual favorite weapon in the game is the Gauss cannon, which is just a railgun that fires a highly damaging projectile with a fairly fast reload speed and incredibly high range. This thing is pretty effective against most targets, though fast-moving assault mechs might be able to strafe away from the projectile. Finally, missile weapons are actually pretty varied. The most common loadout are the short-range crossbow missiles that do minimal damage but offer target lock and fast reload. And them hammer missiles don't track the target at all, and they travel pretty slowly, however the explosion damage is fairly high. They also allow the player to adjust the fuse time on the missiles, allowing you to fire projectiles that will explode mid-flight or travel until they hit something. Then the javelin missiles do exactly what you would think. They travel slowly after being fired before suddenly accelerating towards their target, and they're best used at medium to long range. While I would have preferred full customization, the varied loadouts that the battle mechs come with in this game are at least varied and fun. When you factor in the fact that every weapon can be upgraded up to level 3 by picking up power-ups during missions, there's actually a good amount of variety on offer. Just doesn't seem like it on a surface level. All the level 1 weapons have infinite ammo, but picking up a power-up and leveling the corresponding armament up will only last for a certain amount of shots. This caused me to immediately switch back to other weapons whenever I picked up anything, as I wanted to save the better ammo for harder encounters later in the mission. Of course, that comes down to your individual playstyle, but it kept me cycling through all of the available weapons instead of sticking with my favorite the entire time. While you don't have to worry about ammo in MechAssault, every action that you do generates a stat called heat. From firing and charging weapons to using jump jets and thrusters, heat bar is a universal energy pool for all of your mech's functions. Get the heat meter too high and you're pretty much defenseless, so it's a good idea to swap between high damage weapons and weapons that only output a little bit of heat so you don't make yourself a sitting duck. Some of the battle mechs also come equipped with defensive countermeasures that can be deployed for various effects. Some let you turn invisible, which seemed pretty pointless in single player, but I can imagine would be interesting online. There's an anti-missile flare that attracts enemy missiles for a few seconds, and can be really powerful if deployed in the middle of a battle. Overall, the defensive abilities add another layer on top of the normal combat, even if there are only a few of them and only certain mechs have the ability to even use them. One of the biggest aspects of MechAssault is its destruction system. Basically, every building that you come across can be blown up, and they often take multiple shots while showing damage that is actually really impressive for 2002. While it's not on the level of something like Battlefield Bad Company or Red Faction Guerrilla, it's really cool to pan the camera around a city after an intense mech battle to see the pockmarked buildings and smoking craters. There is even incentive for the player to destroy enemy buildings, as the rubble sometimes produces salvage, which is how the player upgrades their weapons. You do want to be careful though, as some buildings like fuel depots will cause a huge explosion that will kill you. Don't ask how I know. I even noticed that on certain multiplayer maps there is some huge environmental destruction, at least for the time. Like this winter map where you can collapse an ice bridge and kill everyone standing under it. Again, I wasn't able to actually play any multiplayer, but I can definitely see why there's still such a cult following for it online. When it comes to the game's presentation, MechAssault definitely screams 2002 original Xbox. While it doesn't have the lighting of Splinter Cell or the style of Jet Set Radio Future, MechAssault is charming in its own right. Not totally sure how to describe how this game feels in a 3D space, besides saying that it sort of feels like you zoomed in on a 3D RTS and made it an action game. Something about the layout of the maps, waves of enemies, and how the buildings are placed down in the bases just feel like I should be looking at it from a bird's eye view. Sometimes missions even remind me of something out of an RTS. For instance, midway through the campaign, you attack an enemy power plant. At the base there's a garage that will continually spawn mechs to attack you, so you need to destroy the building as soon as possible so that you don't get swarmed. If this game does one thing perfect, it is the explosions and sound design. When enemy mechs explode, they give off an earth-shattering explosion that just feels good to hear. Not to mention anything caught in the blast takes a heavy amount of damage. Yeah, that's an actual strategy in MechAssault, baiting enemies towards each other and then focusing on one to take them all down in a chain reaction. Playing this game with a nice sound setup is honestly impressive, and during the more chaotic missions where there are multiple enemy mechs and tanks with your allies yelling at you over the radio, well, it just becomes more than the sum of its parts, and it's probably the most visceral aspect of the game. I really wish I could use the game's soundtrack during this video because it's a really good listen. Unfortunately, it's in the Content ID system on YouTube, so if I play any of it, it's just gonna get claimed. It's a guitar-heavy complement to MechAssault's fast action, and I have to admit, when you're mid-mission with mechs and tanks shooting everywhere and you've got these heavy metal guitar riffs in the background, well, it does do something to get your blood pumping. If I had to complain about one thing when it comes to presentation, I just think that this game has such a subdued color palette. Even during the daytime missions, it feels like playing in Twilight. This was before the 360 generation of gray and brown games, but I definitely can taste that style of visuals here. I can forgive some muddy textures on things like the ground and buildings because the main attraction, the mechs, actually look really good. Each one is pretty detailed and there's quite a variety. though it does suck that half of them are just retextures like the Mad Cat and Timberwolf. Just like how the buildings take visual damage, the battle mechs also display their remaining armor through visual damage and changing animation. A heavily damaged mech has plumes of smoke rolling off of it with busted armor. It starts limping and moving slower and eventually topples over before exploding. There's quite a large amount of detail to the mechs, making the relatively simple combat loop visceral and exciting. Just thinking about how this game was one of the very first offerings available for Xbox Live, it kind of had me putting myself in the mindset of someone who might be playing this, for the first time 21 years ago. While I can see myself being disappointed with the lackluster customization or the lack of any sort of mech garage where you can build your own loadouts, the truth is that the combat loop that is on offer here is fun and addicting. So I don't think it's any wonder that this game still has a cult following out there. Battletech fans will probably be annoyed by this game's lack of adherence to the universe's lore and design, especially when it comes down to mixing up the names of some of the battle mechs, and anyone who is uninitiated in Battletech before going into MechAssault isn't exactly getting a great primer for the depth of the universe. But at the end of the day, MechAssault is a fun arcadey mech combat action game that throws the sim elements to the wind in favor of fast action with environmental destruction. It's a shame that this game just doesn't work on either the 360 or Series X. Unless you have an original Xbox laying around or want to get into the realm of Xbox emulation, MechAssault remains a gem of the past, destined to live on through the memories of those first subscribers to Xbox Live. And hey, maybe you saw this video and remembered that you have this game sitting in a box in a closet somewhere, and now you have an urge to revisit and remember a younger and simpler time of giant explosions and 70-ton mechs. Hello and welcome to the end card for this extra video that I put out. I finally did it. I got around to putting out another video about a video game, and this one's even about mechs, so that's interesting. It's just something I've been wanting to do for a little bit, and so I finally put my mind to and did it. Anyway, let's thank all of my awesome channel members, aka Batosai, Argan, Griever, Brian Sanchez, D. Mills, Daniel Johnson, Danky Stank, Swanky Mank, Gert, Joe Castellanos, Johnny G, Canto 20, McLean Nugent, Trey Hardy, Video Game Player 75, and Yo-Yo Mitch. Thank you guys very much for being channel members. You are amazing, and it's just really cool to see people that like the content enough that they throw a few bucks my way. That's super sick. Thank you very much. I've been feeling really nostalgic for old Xbox and Xbox 360 era stuff. I'm in the process of buying a Series X, mostly just for the backwards compatibility. And I don't know, I just kind of want to make a little bit more content about that eventually, because that's what I grew up with. I grew up with the 360 and original Xbox and PS2, so windows open and there's a motorcycle going by that's very loud and manly. But anyway, so yeah, I grew up with that shit, and I just have really been enjoying talking about it and watching videos about it. So maybe I'll do a little bit more content about that stuff, extra on the side like this. So if that's something that people would enjoy seeing, if you want to see more gaming stuff in general, like videos like this, just let me know. The gaming channel has kind of fallen by the wayside because I just didn't have time to do everything. I severely underestimated the amount of time everything would take, so that is kind of how that ended up. But maybe I can go back to it at some point in the future. Either way, I think this video was pretty cool. It was really fun to make, and I really do hope you enjoyed it. Thank you once again to everyone who subscribed, commented, liked, took the time out of their day to watch me ramble about some game from 21 years ago that only very few people remember. Well, probably more than normal. Anyway, We will see you again soon for something anime related, I'm sure. And until then, I hope you have a great day.